She stood at the head of the boardroom table, like she'd already signed the contracts, already cashed the checks, already decided the rest of us were furniture. And maybe in her mind she had, because her father owned the company, and that, apparently, was credential enough. I'd been with Northgate Aerospace Solutions for 19 years, not as a figurehead, not as someone who showed up for the quarterly reviews and put his name on slide decks. I was the one who flew to Ottawa in January with ice still on my boots to shake hands with DND procurement officers. I was the one who'd spent 3 years building the relationship with the team at DRDC, the Defense Research and Development Canada, back when nobody thought that relationship was worth building. I knew which directors liked to talk hockey before getting down to business. I knew which ones needed numbers first, feelings never. I knew, almost to the minute, how long you had to let silence sit before someone at a federal table would fill it with a yes. My clearance level wasn't something you got by taking a weekend course. It took years of background checks, referrals, and a file that apparently runs to 400 pages. At Northgate, I was the only person with the level required to handle classified contract negotiations with national defense. The only one. I want you to remember that part. My daughter called me the night before the big announcement to say she'd seen the email going around internally. She was in HR at the time, junior level, and she wasn't supposed to have seen it. But she had. She told me to brace myself. I told her she was probably misreading something. I'd been at that company since she was in middle school. I'd helped them land 4 major federal contracts. I'd turned a regional aerospace supplier into something that could sit at a table with Pratt & Whitney and not look out of place. I was not bracing myself. The announcement came at 9 in the morning, all hands meeting, coffee still hot in my hand. The CEO, the founder, a man I'll call my old friend, because that's what I'd believed him to be for 15 years, stood at the front of the room and talked about the company entering a new phase. A modernization initiative, streamlined leadership, fresh eyes. Standing beside him was his son-in-law, 28 years old, MBA from Rotman in Toronto, never worn a hard hat in his life. He had that particular kind of confidence you sometimes see in people who've been told they're exceptional for so long that they've stopped questioning it. He was wearing a blazer that probably cost more than my first car. He had a new title, Chief Strategy Officer, and I had a new role, Advisory Consultant, Transitional Capacity. I'm going to be honest with you. I didn't understand what that meant at first. It sounded like something. It had words in it. But when I went back to my office and pulled up the org chart that had been updated that morning, I saw that my reporting line had been severed. The federal contracts team now reported to my old friend's son-in-law. My security clearance still sat in my personnel file, but the job that required it no longer had my name on it. I sat in my office for a long time that day, looking out the window at the parking lot, at the gray Edmonton sky, at the flag snapping in the wind above the building entrance. 19 years. I'd helped build what was behind me, and I'd just been handed a title that meant nothing. What I didn't know yet, what none of us knew, was that Northgate was 6 weeks away from the final stage of the most significant contract in the company's history. The project was called ARIS, Aerospace Reconnaissance Integration Systems. It was a joint initiative between the Department of National Defense and 2 Crown corporations, and the total value of the contract was just under $4 billion over 12 years. It had been in negotiation for 2.5 years. I had been the lead liaison the entire time. I knew every person on the federal side by first name. I'd been to their offices in Gatineau. I'd sat across from the deputy minister's senior staff. I knew the security classifications involved. I knew the language the contract had to use to satisfy Treasury Board guidelines. I knew things about that deal that weren't written down anywhere, because some of the most important parts of federal contract relationships are never written down. They live in conversations over dinner. They live in the trust you've built by showing up on time, every time, and never overpromising. They live in the moment when someone on the government side lowers their voice and tells you something informally, because they trust you enough to tell you before it becomes official. My old friend's son-in-law didn't know any of that. He didn't know there was anything to know. I tried in my new advisory capacity to brief him. I asked for a meeting. He gave me 45 minutes on a Thursday afternoon, and he spent the first 10 of those minutes on his phone. When I started walking him through the relational history of the Aris file, the sensitivities around certain deputy-level personnel, the fact that the DND team had specific concerns about the AI integration component that needed to be addressed carefully, the informal understanding we'd reached about transition timelines. He nodded along with the expression of someone waiting for you to finish. When I was done, he said, and I will remember this sentence for the rest of my life, I think we're overcomplicating this. Government procurement is just a sales process. I've built a framework. He had a slide deck, 43 slides. It had a section called Disrupting the Traditional Procurement Relationship Model. There was an AI-generated executive summary at the front that I noticed contained a factual error about the scope of the Aris contract. When I pointed this out, he said the summary was a placeholder. I asked him if he had reviewed the classification requirements for the final negotiation meetings. He looked at me in a way that told me he had no idea what I was referring to. I explained that the final phase of Aris involved discussions at a classification level that required specific personnel clearances, that I was the only person at Northgate with the necessary clearance, that he could not legally be in the room for those conversations. He thanked me for the context and said he'd look into it. 3 weeks later, I was informed that my advisory contract would not be renewed beyond the end of the fiscal quarter. My old friend delivered this news by email. 19 years, and it came by email. I spent a weekend being angry. Then I called a former colleague of mine who'd left Northgate 4 years earlier to join a firm in Calgary that did federal infrastructure consulting. He'd been trying to recruit me for 2 years. I called him on a Sunday evening, and by Tuesday morning I had a meeting scheduled. By the end of the following week, I had an offer letter on my kitchen table. I signed it. I handed in my equipment. I cleaned out my office on a Wednesday afternoon, and the receptionist I'd known for 11 years cried a little when she hugged me goodbye. I didn't cry. I shook a lot of hands, smiled at people I genuinely liked, and walked out to my truck in the parking lot. I didn't look back. I figured there was nothing left to see. I was wrong about that, as it turned out. About 3 weeks after I started my new position in Calgary, I got a call from an old contact on the DND procurement side, someone who'd been my counterpart on the Aris file for 2 years. He wasn't calling in an official capacity. He was calling because he thought I should know. The first formal meeting of the final Aris negotiation phase had taken place the week before. My old friend's son-in-law had led the Northgate delegation. He had brought 2 members of his new strategy team, both of them recent graduates, neither of them cleared, when the DND team lead had asked to verify attendee clearances before the session could formally begin. Standard protocol, something I had done correctly on every previous occasion. My old friend's son-in-law had apparently been surprised by the request. There was a recess while his team scrambled to reach someone in their legal department. The recess lasted over an hour. When it became clear that the clearance issue couldn't be resolved on the spot, the government side adjourned the meeting. They hadn't rescheduled it. My contact told me the atmosphere had shifted. When you're dealing with national defense and a contract of that classification, trust isn't just a nice thing to have. It's load-bearing. The relationship we'd built over 2.5 years had been predicated on the government side's confidence that Northgate understood the rules of the room, that we respected the protocols, that when we said we were prepared, we were prepared. In one afternoon, that confidence had been damaged in a way that a slide deck cannot fix. But the clearance issue was only part of it. The other part, my contact told me, and his voice had the careful tone of someone who is being diplomatic about something infuriating, was the proposal document that Northgate had submitted in advance of the meeting. I hadn't seen it. I'd been gone by then, but he described it to me, and I recognized it immediately. It was the AI-generated executive summary I'd flagged in my Thursday afternoon meeting with my old friend's son-in-law. The placeholder, that was still a placeholder when it had been sent to the Department of National Defense as a formal submission. The one with the factual error about contract scope. The one that used generic business language in a document that needed to reflect specific classified parameters. The DND team had noticed. Of course they had noticed. These were people who read contracts the way surgeons read imaging results, looking for exactly the kind of anomaly that tells you something is wrong underneath. My contact said, "We started to wonder if Northgate still had the institutional knowledge to execute this." I didn't say what I was thinking. I just listened, and when he was done, I thanked him for the call, and I sat for a while in my new office in Calgary, smaller than my old one, with a view of a parking structure instead of a flag, and I thought about $4 billion. The formal notification came 5 weeks later, through channels that were entirely official and entirely brutal in their bureaucratic neutrality. The Aerospace contract had been reopened for competitive bidding. Northgate's negotiating position had been voided on the basis of process non-compliance. There was a reference to documentation irregularities. There was a reference to personnel qualification concerns. The language was careful and said nothing that wasn't true. $4 billion. Gone in a process document. I heard about the fallout secondhand, from the receptionist who still texted me occasionally, and from my former colleague who had friends inside. The board met in emergency session twice in the same week. The question of shareholder liability was raised. There was talk of legal review. My old friend, the CEO, the man I had called a friend for 15 years, issued an internal memo that described the situation as a process learning opportunity. His son-in-law was reassigned, not fired, reassigned. He moved from Chief Strategy Officer to something called Director of Digital Transformation Initiatives, which, I'm told, is a title that exists in a part of the org chart that doesn't touch federal procurement. I heard that when the board reviewed the sequence of events and realized that the one person with the necessary clearance had been walked out the door 6 weeks before the final negotiation phase, the room went very quiet. I was not there for that moment, but I've imagined it more than once. What I kept coming back to, in those weeks, wasn't the vindication. I want to be clear about that. There's a version of this story where I'm supposed to feel satisfied, where the collapse of the deal is some kind of cosmic justice, some earned settling of accounts. I didn't feel that way, and I'll tell you why. A lot of people I cared about worked at Northgate, people who had nothing to do with any of this. The machinists in the shop, the engineers who'd spent years developing the Aerospace integration systems, the contracts coordinator who'd worked with me on every federal file for a decade, and knew that process documentation better than I did. Those people didn't make the decision to push me out. They didn't build the 43-slide deck, and they were the ones who would feel a $4 billion loss in their jobs, their pensions, their Christmas bonuses. So no, it wasn't satisfying in the way a story like this is supposed to be satisfying. What it was clarifying. I had spent 19 years believing that doing the job well was enough, that the relationships, the clearances, the institutional knowledge, that these things were visible, that they had weight, that if you were the person who made the complicated things work, you were safe. What I learned is that expertise is invisible until it's gone, and by then, the people who didn't value it are busy writing memos about learning opportunities. About 4 months after I left, my old friend called me. Not by email this time. He called my cell on a Saturday morning, and when I answered, he said my name in the voice of a man who is preparing to say something he finds difficult. I let the silence sit. I'd learned from 19 years of federal procurement that silence has weight, and sometimes the most effective thing you can do is let someone else fill it. He said he'd made a mistake. He said the company was in a difficult position. He said he wanted to talk about the possibility of me returning in a consulting capacity to help reestablish the Aerospace relationship with DND, on the off chance the bidding process could be navigated in a way that gave Northgate a second opportunity. I asked him what the consulting capacity would involve. He described a role that was, in almost every meaningful way, the job I'd been doing for 19 years. The same responsibilities, the same relationships, the same classified meetings, the same clearance requirements, the same 15-hour days before federal submission deadlines. I asked him what compensation he had in mind. He named a number. It was generous, more than I'd been making before. I thought about the email, the 45 minutes on a Thursday afternoon, the placeholder document, the receptionist who cried, the parking lot on a Wednesday afternoon. I said, I appreciate you calling. I want you to know I bear no ill will toward you or toward the company. But I'm committed to where I am. I think Northgate needs someone who's been part of what comes next, not someone who remembers what came before. I paused, and then I said, I hope the decisions made in that boardroom are ones the people in it can be proud of, looking back. I genuinely do. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he understood. We said goodbye in the way that two men say goodbye when they both know they probably won't speak again. I put the phone down and went to make coffee. My daughter called an hour later. She'd left Northgate by then. She'd found a better position with a tech firm in Vancouver, which was the right move for her, regardless of everything else. She asked how I was doing. I told her about the call. She was quiet for a second, and then she said, "Did you want to go back?" I thought about it honestly, the way she deserved. No, I told her. The work I'm doing now is the same work, with people who know what it's worth. And that makes all the difference. She said she was proud of me. I told her I was proud of her too, which was also true, and more important. A few months ago, I heard through the industry grapevine that the Aeris retendering process had concluded. Northgate had not been awarded the contract. The $4 billion project went to a firm out of Halifax with a long history of defense work, and I noticed this detail when I read the announcement. A lead procurement officer who had spent 22 years building relationships with D&D. My current firm bid on a portion of the supporting work. We got it. Last week, I was in Ottawa for a preliminary meeting, and I sat across from two people I'd worked with on the original Aeris file. We caught up for a few minutes before the formal session started. One of them asked how things were going. I said they were going well, which was true. Then she smiled and said, "Glad you landed somewhere that knows what you bring." I thanked her. And then we got down to business, because that's what you do when the table is ready and the right people are in the room. Some lessons cost one meeting. Some cost $4 billion. The difference, usually, is whether someone decided that experience was an obstacle to clear rather than an asset to keep. I've told this story to a few people since it happened. A junior analyst on my current team asked me about it once, after a particularly grueling federal submission week. He was exhausted, a little cynical, wondering if the bureaucratic rigor was worth it. Whether the protocols and the clearances and the relationship building and the careful attention to what you're not allowed to write in an AI-generated summaries. Whether any of it actually mattered in the end. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, "Son, let me tell you about a company that found out the hard way.